Hi everyone, this is a session which will go through the school's feedback policy. Firstly, we're going to start with talking through the vision. So the reason we have a feedback policy and not a marking policy is because we show that feedback can take place in two ways. It can take place either verbally or it can take place written. So the first bit says at Pickhurst Infant Academy, we ensure that high expectations are high and matched to the individual child. Through feedback, and that can be written or verbal, staff demonstrate to children that their efforts are valued, they celebrate children's successes, provide appropriate challenge and offer guidance which supports children in their next steps in learning. Wherever possible, feedback will be given at the point of learning where appropriate. Children will be involved in self-assessment and peer feedback. Staff will encourage children to use the feedback that they have been given to improve their learning. So really, this is all about kind of marking or feedback rather having an impact. So does the feedback that we've given children firstly help them identify the things that they are achieving in? So it's really important they know what they're doing well and what they're what they're succeeding in and what they're getting right. And also, does it help them understand the things that they're finding challenging and things that they need to address, and is it moving their learning on? We want to ensure that all the feedback we give children helps them move on in their next stage of development. So the next part of the policy talks about the aims, and the bits that I've highlighted in green are bits that have been additions recently. So they're recent additions to the feedback policy. So our aim is to ensure that feedback support children in making substantial and sustained progress. And we want to ensure that children use the feedback in order to improve their own learning. We want to ensure consistency of feedback throughout the school. So this is where, when we had our review, this is something that wasn't as consistent. So, there were varied amounts of detailed annotations in children's books. This was also varying across subjects. There was varied amounts of verbal feedback that was being given, etc. So this hopefully with us going through this as a staff, it ensures that we're able to be consistent within year groups across the school, and we're showing that everybody in our school is adhering to the policy, because this has been created with the thought and having basically children in mind, and ensuring that all the marking and feedback that children are receiving is having an impact on them. To assist children, to recognise and encourage and reward children's efforts and progress. We often see so much of in our books. We see lots of stickers and stampers and annotations that children have been given golden tickets, and that's really important. It's to assist the monitoring of children's progress and inform future planning. So the annotations that adults put into children's books about how a child may have needed support, how maybe a child has used a resource or a particular strategy, they are all things that help us assess where children are. Because, for example, in writing, sometimes children's writing can look better on some days than on others, and that can be varied things. It can just be as simple as that, they're working completely on their own, or that they're a bit tired, or they weren't well. But it can also be because actually some scaffolds, some support and resources have been used to enable children to excel and achieve in their learning, and it's really important that's reflected in the marking, so that we don't end up assessing children as being kind of more confident or independent, and therefore putting them at a higher stage of attainment than they actually are at that moment, because they've been given some scaffolds to support them in getting there, which is really important, but it helps us get that accurate and robust assessment. And where appropriate or needed, subject-specific feedback will be given to move children on in their learning. For example, addressing a misconception in a science lesson. And I'm going to skip forwards and then I'll clarify why we've put the bullet point in green. And then we've put that marking will encourage high standards in English, for example, where appropriate. In cross-curricular learning, an incorrect spelling or phase-appropriate tricky word will be corrected by the teacher or child. However, this does not need to be addressed as a next step. So what we're saying is that, and what this means is that if you are teaching, an RE session or, DT or a history or geography session, for example, a curricular subject, and a child, you've noticed it in their writing or in their learning that they have misspelt a tricky word, you need to address that, because we don't want children to think that is the correct way to spell a tricky word. And we know that, tricky words are quite important in terms of children's development and sentence writing. So it needs to be addressed, but not put as a next step. So the next step that a child is given, or the verbal feedback that you're really focusing on, should be on something in relation to the learning objective for that lesson. And what I would say is that if you're not sure on how to move a child on in a curricular subject, then do sometimes you can get really high attaining children that just they're moving on and they're moving on to challenges and you're not sure. Then do touch base with that class teacher and ask them about the next steps that would be appropriate. Just move that, there we go. So however, coming back to those incorrect spellings and those tricky words, they can just be addressed by you just marking that correctly next to the child's writing or just above the words that they have spelt incorrectly. That shows that you've addressed it, but it's not been made into a big thing where we've asked the children to do it as a next step and copy it out 3 times, because the focus in that session and the moving the learning on with the next step should be primarily around the subject area and the learning intention. So that's why we've put that in green, because that is kind of a new addition to the policy. Okay, so how will marking be implemented? So, where possible, verbal feedback will be given at the point of learning, and feedback must be given before the next session. So we're saying that ideally, the best case scenario is that children receive verbal feedback as they're doing it, as they're learning. And we know that from research, there's lots of research into this, feedback at the point of learning can make as much as sort of 6 to 8 months progress for individuals. And if you're interested in that, the Education Endowment Fund did a piece of research on feedback, which is really highly regarded in terms of impact and strategies in school. So verbal feedback at the point of learning where you can, okay, and we'll talk about how that's indicated in a second. And the other reason we firmly believe in verbal feedback also at the point of learning where possible. I know it's not possible to get around everybody, so please don't worry, but it also ensures that it reduces the workload of those leading the session, so that they're not having sort of 20 to 30 books to mark at the end of the session once the learning's over. We want to capture that and move the learning on as it's happening, ideally, so that A, it has that impact, but B, it also reduces workload. Any adult writing will model the school's approach to handwriting. And I know that this can be a challenge if you have a style of handwriting and you've been writing like that all your life. So we do understand that this is a challenge. However, we just really do ask staff to really be mindful of it, maybe slow down when they're writing, so that children are really seeing the models that we would expect. So any model of writing that children see in their books, in school, on displays, on their learning, in terms of learning intentions that are written at the top of the sheet, etc., should all be modelling the approach to handwriting, because we want that to be of the highest standards to support them. Children must be given time to respond to verbal feedback, and revisit and correct or improve their work where next steps and errors have been indicated. This must be responded to before the next session. So we want children to be able to have time to respond to that feedback that you're giving, because you've identified something that's going to move that learning on, and ultimately it's a missed opportunity if they don't get that opportunity to respond to it. So no point in giving it, really. I think we'll all be in agreement of that if the child can't respond to it. So this is now all learning will. So our policy has been divided up into all learning and some learning will. And that really helps us identify in terms of what we're expecting to see in all learning and some learning. So all learning will be dated by the adult, and we've also highlighted all the child, because actually, some children, particularly as they get more confident and older, they are able to write the date themselves, particularly in year 2. But what we don't want them to do is spend all the time writing the date and missing out time addressing and attempting the learning objective. So all learning will be marked against the learning objective, and that's an I can statement with an E, an A, a PA, or a WT. So the E is exceeded, and we'll talk a little bit about that and how we assess that and how do we know that. But A is achieved, PA partially achieved, WT working towards, and unless it's a final piece of celebration. So what we're saying is, if a child is writing a lovely poem to go up on display, we wouldn't necessarily expect the learning objective to be on there, marking stampers all over it, VF, because it's for an audience, and children learn that actually as writers we go through that drafting process, we make corrections, we address things, and sometimes we're doing our best learning to be drafted up as that final draft to go up on display. And so we are saying that actually that we would see that in our school sometimes, so that's okay. Sometimes teachers like to do it on the back of the learning, so it's still there when they take it down or when they pop it into their folder eventually or book. So going back to the E, the exceeded, that is if a child has gone beyond meeting the intention that the whole class are doing. So if there's a learning intention set for the whole class, but a challenge has been given, or you have given some verbal feedback for them to add something into their learning or to move that learning on further, and they've done that. So, if the class objective is to write a simple sentence, but actually you've given verbal feedback to child A, to include an adjective in their learning or some descriptive language, that would be them exceeding the objective. They've gone beyond the intention that's been set for the session. Okay. And then it goes on to say the learning objective may also be indicated within a comment when marking, particularly in reception and year 1. In reception, year 1, this will be recorded within guided group activities and adult directed learning. So just to clarify this, any work, any learning that has been directed by the teacher. So that means guided work, where you're guiding the learning objective for that session, or it can also mean in continuous provision, where the teacher has said, for example, on the literacy table today, we are going to be making zigzag books, and I would like you to find a tricky word on the table, look at it, put it down, cover it, write it on your tricky word book, and then check it and see if you've got it correctly. Let's see how many tricky words you can put in your zigzag book. That has been directed by the teacher. That isn't something the child has done, thought of themselves. It has been led by the adult in the sense of they've directed it, they've given that intention that they want them to practice those tricky words. And in which case, in the annotation, you would just need to indicate that. So well done, you've created a great tricky word zigzag book, excellent spellings, well done, or something like that. Whereas for other pieces of learning that children in continuous provision have created themselves, it's not necessary to do that. It doesn't need an intention there was no intention because the child made it up themselves and decided what they intended to do with their learning. So number 3, correct learning will be ticked, and any incorrect will be marked with a dot. So errors that need addressing by the child will have an up arrow by them. So it's important, as we were saying, that children are aware of what they're getting correct and what they are doing to achieve their learning objective. So if in your session is about using phonic knowledge and you've seen that a child has written the word rain correctly, you could tick that. Say, well done, I'm going to tick this because you have spelt the word rain correctly, and today we were trying to practice using our phonics and you've done that. You've written, your phonics, you've used your phonics to spell a word. And if there's an incorrect, then you mark that with a dot. And if it's at the time of learning, you can just dot it, and then the child can do that when you give them that feedback. Or you can, in addition, put the up arrow next to it if it's something they're coming back to the next day. But what we would say is that any incorrect learning must be addressed, because it could be a miscalculation, it could be a misconception, but it's important that we are showing children that there's something that's not quite right with that, and we address it. Otherwise it looks like it's been left. So that's number 4 now, is about indicating whether the learning was completed independently or with support. And that we use those abbreviations I, WTS, TAS and WISAS. So we've added that ISAS in there. It was always in the annotation abbreviations bit at the bottom, but we've just included it here as well. So what we have said is that what we don't want to do is create unnecessary marking. So if there's nothing on the child's work that indicates whether they're independent or if they've had support, the assumption is they're independent with it. So it's marked by exception in the sense of support will be annotated if they've had it. However, we've added in green here that we're also mindful that, like sometimes in maths, they've had support with a couple of questions, but then they've gone on to do one independently, and then they might have needed a bit of support again. And with that, you would annotate which ones are I and which ones are have needed support. So in that situation, you may be needing to annotate individual parts of the learning to reflect the level of support and independence that they've had. So I hope that is clear. So I'm just going to move on to the second page now. So this is all about how we indicate. So we want to ensure that in the feedback it is indicated with if support is given, with annotations of the type of support given. So it's really not helpful to anybody if it just says with TS or with TAS or with IS and it doesn't say anything else. Because our question would be, what did they need support with? That's the bit that tells us intrinsically really about, where they are with their learning development. Did they need support counting with one-to-one correspondence? Did they need support identifying the digraphs on their chart? Did they need support with adults giving ideas for content for what to write, or did they need support in coming up with the right strategy, or did you intervene with an age-related child and see that they were actually counting in year 1 with cubes to calculate an addition story when actually you wanted them to use the strategy of counting on, because to be age related in year 1, that's what you need to be able to do really from the beginning, because that's an expectation for the early learning goal and reception to be able to count on. So you may be that may be some with TA support or with teacher support to use counting on method. That tells us that child wasn't doing that and they've needed a bit of guidance with that. So it tells us a little bit about their development. And so how did the adult support the learning? Detail annotated by adult. Was a resource provided? So did you support by giving a resource? Did you notice that actually Tommy wasn't forming his letters correctly, so you said, Tommy, I'm going to give you, a handwriting chart so that you can have a look at how the letters are formed. When you're forming your A, remember, around the apple, up and down, have a look. I'm going to leave the chart next to you. You've provided a resource to move that on, so you would need to annotate that, with teacher support, to use, handwriting mat or something like that, or with TAS, EP for environmental print for letter formation. Okay. And then also did a peer help. So did you go over and did you say to Matthew, now I'd like you and you and Tommy to have a look at some of your your maths and have a look at the dots that aren't quite right. Can you together work out what the problem was? Particularly if you find that a child is needing a bit of support, working with a peer can be really helpful. So number 6 is about receiving feedback that moves the learning on. So this is kind of really at the heart, I think, of the policy. So we've talked about that this can be given through verbal feedback, which is at a next step at the time of learning. And we want to ensure that our marking is consistent, and this is always now in black pen, so I've just highlighted that. Or it can be highlighted with a stamper. We had some VF stampers before, just like that one there. So if you have that in your classroom and you want to use that, that's absolutely fine. And that's indicated, so if you are writing that on in black pen, it's been indicated with a VF, okay? Or it may be that the feedback you give is written through a next step. So this is where the written part of the policy comes in, and it can be given like either when the learning is happening or after the learning has taken place. So ideally it's all VF at the time of learning, but there may be something that you want to give as a bit of a next step just at the time of learning, that you're picking up that actually they've written a sentence that's got 3 A's that have been spelt incorrectly, and you don't want them to, or written formed incorrectly. You don't want them to carry on writing the rest of their story, embedding that incorrect formation of the letter A. So you might just say, Hannah, I'm going to pause you for a second. You're doing some great writing, but I just noticed that actually I'll have a look at your A's. What do you notice? Get them to reflect, and then you can give them a next step, either right at the bottom of their book or on the other page, where they can have a go at that. And then obviously there are lots of written next steps that sometimes are after the learning's has taken place, which involves the child going back to. So an up arrow so this can take place in lots of different ways. It could be there's an up arrow with something appropriate to practice or address to correct. So these next steps will be completed by the child in pencil, and we'll clarify a bit in a minute about green pen and pencil to make sure that we're all clear and consistent across the school with that. But basically, if you haven't got round to a child in the lesson, to give them a verbal feedback next step, and there you are marking their learning at the end of the session, and you've noticed that they've spelt something incorrectly, you've noticed they've got an incorrect formation, or you want them to go back and add something. Or actually, no, this is all about kind of things to practice. So you'd put an up arrow and then put that there for them to practice, to complete in pencil. This next one is about being provided with a simple task that could address a next step that they could do in their book, that can be stuck in directly after the next step. So this can be something like a challenge that you've given, or it can be that there's a task or an activity that would be a good next step for that child, and that's sort of where it gets stuck in, or it's being given as a task underneath their learning that they can then complete. And, sometimes that does happen in the lesson. So next step challenge, and they've got a challenge task, that's again then being moved on and they've had a next step given at the time of the learning, or it can be after. Once the learning's been completed, there might be something that you want them to do. And the third way is that it may be that the evidence of them addressing the next step might be in another piece of learning. So the reason why we've got that is because actually sometimes in reception a child may have completed some adult directed learning. So, they've gone and done that tricky word zigzag book, and they've brought it to you to celebrate after they've done it, because it wasn't a guided piece of work, it was directed, and I've done it, I've brought it over, you're celebrating it together, and you've noticed something. You've noticed that when they write the word little or you've noticed their T's are formed slightly differently and not in the correct formation, and you want to pick up on that. You might just verbally tell them at the end, and you might annotate it on their book, or it may be that they've missed out finger spaces. So you'll say to them, they've brought you a lovely sentence they've written and they've missed their finger spaces. It sometimes is not appropriate then to say to a child, right, can you now write your sentence out using finger spaces, because you're just glad that they've had a go. And that's particularly for young writers, for those developing writers, that's enough just to celebrate and to focus on the things they've been doing. And actually children need to be developmentally ready for next steps. Oh, sorry, my computer has just, so I'm accessing this remotely, just going to log back in. Go. Oh, let's try again. The thing about technology, isn't it? Look. Oh no, wrong password. Apologies. Right, I'm just going to have to put this down for a second. Okay, we're back. So on that point, so it would be okay for you to say, just to them, give that to them verbally, and then at the bottom of their tricky word zigzag book, you can just put next step up, just do the up arrow and just put finger spaces or letter formation T, because you've just given it, you've mentioned that to them, but you're not expecting them to do anything with it at that time, but you're hoping that they'll take that feedback on and include it then in future learning. So just to mention that. Now we have said that in the policy we made it really clear that if a child is responding to feedback that you have given at the time of learning, specific feedback you've given them to make a correction or make an edit to their learning, that is completed by the child in green pen. You have given that specific feedback to be completed by that child. You've given that specific feedback for that child to go back and do something to their work. Okay, so it's specific feedback in the sense of it's not, it's not just, oh, now can you go and have a look at back through your learning. It's actually, let's have a look at this part of your learning, and what do you notice about the end of your sentences. And the child may say, oh, I've not used an end stop, I've not used a full stop, and you'd say, absolutely, well done, I'd like you now to edit and correct that. And in which case the child would go back and edit that in green pen. Okay, any next steps which are completed after the session has been completed, like any of the up arrows after the lesson, that's completed in pencil, as we mentioned. And any learning where you have said to the child, now look, now you've finished your learning, I want you to go back and just have a look through it and see if there's anything you want to make a bit better or you think might improve your learning, that gets completed in pencil. Oh, it's my cat, that gets completed in pencil. Okay, so just to clarify, any specific feedback given to the child about their learning, they edit in green pen on their work. Any general reminders, or let's remember all the important things that we need to include in our writing, or just check through your calculations, just make sure they're correct, that gets completed in pencil. Okay. I know that green pen is often used in year 2 really frequently for editing and self-editing, but moving forwards, it's the only time a child will use green pen in their books is when they have been given specific feedback on something. So it's not a general reminder, it's specific feedback. Or look now Rosie, I'd like you to have a think about the language you've used. Do you think that is the most appropriate word that you could have used for that? What other words could you have used? And she might go, oh yeah, I could have used enormous rather than big. Okay, right. Do you want to edit that now? That's you having a conversation and supporting that child in up-leveling their work. Okay, hope that's clear. And the view is that actually in year 2 what you'll see is more green pen and then convert into more pencil as children become more greater depth and are able to do that without needing your specific input. They should be, as time goes on, be able to up-level their own work and reflect on that and just correct that in pencil rather than needing that specific feedback. Okay. We talked about celebrating next steps and that kind of thing. Celebrating successes through rewards and stickers. And then this is a bit about some learning will. So some learning, they're not all, but some learning will. And this isn't optional, as in some learning may not have this. It is just some learning will, as in we would expect that to see some of this in books. Sorry, my Alexa keeps going off. So some learning will display success criteria such as, and this will be referred to steps of success. And for example, where there's been a process of steps, they'll be either ticked by the teacher or they'll be ticked by the child when they've been met. So these are just a couple of steps that will be included within the lesson where it would be supportive for the children to have almost like some kind of process checklist to help them achieve the learning intention. So particularly in writing, that can be really helpful. And the other thing is that sometimes we want to see children self-assessing their own learning, and also they can do this through some various strategies. So one is to put dotted lines underneath words that they're unsure about spelling. One might be that they show their traffic lights to indicate their level of confidence. The other is that they may tick against success criteria and having, once they've success criteria and having made their own corrections using pencil. These are self-assessment strategies that may be supported by the teacher and teaching assistant or ISA through verbal feedbacks. That might be that you mention to the children that, once you said, can you now have a look through your learning, see if there's anything that doesn't look quite right? Can you make those corrections in pencil? That's a verbal kind of general reminder, but that's you supporting that process. There's a little bit here about who's responsible for marking the children's learning, and there's a little bit here about how marking will be monitored. I'll leave you to have a read through those. And then these are all of the abbreviations that we're using in our marking now. So these are absolutely the same as before. So there haven't been any adjustments with this. We've just slight change down here. So rather than having full stop, we've changed it to end stop, so ES, and spaces for S. So I know that it's often people have been putting FS for finger spaces, but we've changed that just to S because actually in year 2 a finger space can sometimes be too big. So we don't want all children thinking throughout the school that a finger space is the right indicator in terms of a space, but particularly for reception and 1, that's absolutely fine. And we've also just added correct number formation, CNF, as an annotation for maths. So I'll leave you to have a little read through that. But please do, following this session, if there is anything that you would like to go through or have any questions, please do email me. I'm very happy to respond on email or to have a session or a touch base in September. But thanks very much.